At 76, Timothy Spall sits in a dim room where the afternoon light barely touches the wooden floor, as if even the sun hesitates to disturb the silence he has carried for decades. His hands, marked by time and a lifetime of performances, rest quietly on his knees. For a long while, he does not speak. He only breathes, slow, steady, heavy with memory. Then, with a voice roughened not by age but by what he has endured, he finally murmurs the sentence he has kept buried deeper than any role he ever played. There are 5 names I can never forget, 5 shadows I still cannot forgive. It is a confession without spectacle, whispered rather than declared, as though the walls themselves might collapse under the weight of the truth. The man the world knows, warm, resilient, endlessly human, now reveals a fracture beneath the surface, a quiet wound that never closed. The years have softened many things in him, but not these 5 names, not the echoes they left, not the silence they carved. Behind him, photographs fade on the shelves, moments of triumph, laughter, applause. Yet in his eyes there is the same distant glimmer one sees in someone staring at a door that has been shut for far too long, a door he is finally willing to open. But who are these 5 figures that haunt him still? What did they take from him that time could not return? And why, after a lifetime under the lights, does he choose to speak now, in the quietest hour of his own story? The silence that surrounds Timothy Spall today did not begin in old age. It was planted much earlier, in the narrow streets of post-war Battersea where he grew up. Long before the spotlight ever found him, before the applause ever wrapped around his name, there was a small boy who learned to navigate the world through observation rather than noise. His father, a resolute postman, left home before dawn. His mother, gentle but often tired, carried the weight of a household that struggled more than it admitted. In that modest home, words were few, glances carried meaning, and unspoken disappointments floated like dust in the evening light. Timothy discovered early that silence could protect, but it could also wound. He remembered sitting by the window, hearing his parents argue in hushed tones about money, about sacrifices, about dreams postponed. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to feel the tension tightening around his heart like a small fist. From those days, he learned the reflex that would follow him throughout his life. Hold it in, stay calm, keep watching. School wasn't kinder. He was shy, awkward, a boy with a face adults said would grow into itself. While other children sought attention, he sought corners, places where he could disappear without being mocked or misunderstood. But it was in one of those corners, backstage in a small school theater, that something quietly sparked. Under dim lights, he found a strange refuge in pretending to be someone else. Acting didn't erase his fears, but it gave them shape, gave him permission to speak through characters when he couldn't speak for himself. And yet, even as his talent grew, so did a certain mistrust. Not all teachers encouraged him. Not all children were kind. He learned that admiration could be unstable, that people could shift from praise to ridicule with alarming ease. The first seeds of resentment were planted not as anger, but as disappointment. Disappointment in those who should have protected, guided, or simply listened. The boy who watched the world quietly would become a man remembered for his voice and presence. But beneath that strength, the early fractures remained. The sense of being overlooked, misunderstood, or underestimated. The roots of the 5 unforgiven had already begun to form, even if their faces had yet to appear. Timothy Spall's rise was never the tale of a man propelled suddenly into the sky. It was the story of someone who climbed step by step, gripping each rung with a mixture of fear, determination, and a quiet hunger to prove he belonged. The shy boy from Battersea, who once hid in the corners of school halls, found himself drawn to the stage with an instinct he couldn't explain. Acting didn't merely interest him, it called to him, like a faint melody only he seemed able to hear. And so he followed it, first timidly, then with growing conviction. His early years in local theater were marked not by glamour, but by grit. He rehearsed until his voice cracked, volunteered for roles few wanted, and stayed behind to clean the stage long after others had gone home. Those who watched him sensed something different, a seriousness that felt too heavy for his age, a depth that came from the quiet pains of childhood. Teachers encouraged him, Audiences noticed him, and soon he was standing on stages where the lights felt brighter, the expectations higher. The National Youth Theater became his first real turning point. Among bold voices and confident faces, Timothy remained the observer, absorbing gestures, studying silences, analyzing the rhythms of emotion. Directors valued this ability. He wasn't merely acting, he was dissecting humanity and stitching it back together in front of them. Rada refined this instinct. The years he spent there transformed him from a hesitant performer into a force capable of carrying entire stories on his shoulders. Television opened its doors next. His roles in early dramas showed Britain an actor who could be tender without weakness, strong without cruelty, vulnerable without collapse. Then came Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, the breakthrough that reshaped everything. He wasn't just noticed, he was embraced. And soon after, film roles followed, each one adding another layer to a career grounded in authenticity. Audiences trusted him because he felt real. Colleagues respected him because he worked harder than anyone else in the room. But success, as always, carried its price. As his star ascended, certain friendships dimmed. People who once supported him began to pull away, unsettled by his rising visibility. Whispered criticisms found their way back to him, sometimes twisted, sometimes cruel. Projects he had been promised mysteriously shifted to others. Invitations stopped arriving. In an industry built on fragile alliances, Timothy discovered how swiftly admiration could turn into rivalry. Despite the unease, he pressed forward. Performance after performance, he stripped himself bare emotionally, offering characters carved from parts of his own past, his own wounds. The world saw brilliance, but they did not see the quiet ache that followed him home each night, the sense that the higher he climbed, the more fragile the ground beneath him became. He was ascending, undeniably, triumphantly. Yet with each step upward, shadows gathered behind him. And within those shadows, the first clear outlines of the 5 unforgettable names began to emerge. The ascent, as brilliant as it was, could not protect Timothy Spall from the inevitable fractures that come when trust collides with ambition. Success had lifted him into a world where smiles were polished, promises abundant, and loyalty often conditional. But it was in that very world, one he had worked so hard to enter, that the deepest wounds began to form. The first rupture arrived quietly. A project he had nurtured for months, convinced it would redefine his career, was taken from him without warning. The producers, people he once considered allies, offered polite explanations wrapped in industry jargon. But the truth whispered between their lines was sharper. They had chosen someone more bankable, someone whose name glittered more brightly on a poster. For Timothy, the betrayal wasn't in losing the role, it was in realizing how disposable he could become to those who had once praised him. Then came another blow, heavier than the first. A close friend, someone who had walked beside him since their early theater days, began spreading half-truths about him, subtly undermining his reputation. Timothy discovered it accidentally, overhearing comments that made his stomach tighten. He confronted the friend, hoping for a misunderstanding, but received only evasions and a coldness he hadn't expected. Something cracked in him that day. Not rage, but a quiet, enduring disappointment. The kind that settles deep and never fully dissolves. And as if life sensed his vulnerability, it delivered yet another cut. Not professional this time, but painfully personal. A long relationship ended abruptly, leaving behind echoes of words said in anger, words that bruised long after they faded. He remembered standing in the hallway afterward, the house suddenly too large, too silent. It was then he understood how loneliness can feel louder than any argument. Each rupture left a trace, a tightening in the chest, a shift in the way he looked at people, a growing instinct to guard more and share less. The man once eager to trust now measured every gesture, every promise. The wounds did not make him bitter, but they made him cautious. They made him remember. And from those memories, from those fractures, 5 names began carving themselves into the silence he would carry for decades. 5 faces, 5 histories, 5 wounds time could not erase. 5 names. 5 wounds, 5 shadows that Timothy Spall has carried through the years like stones in his pocket, small enough to hide, heavy enough to sink him if he ever stopped moving. He never says them all aloud. He never writes them down. But in the quiet, when the world falls still and memory becomes sharper than truth, he feels each of them as clearly as the lines on his hands. The first name comes with a softness that almost disguises the hurt. She was his earliest companion in the world of theater, a warm spirit who encouraged him when he doubted himself, who believed in him before he believed in his own voice. Their connection was gentle, almost fragile, and yet it was she who drifted away into Mashorabeda Atarkisodoale, not out of malice but out of fear. Fear of being overshadowed, fear of losing her place. One day she simply stopped calling, stopped showing up, stopped being present. The wound she left was quiet, a disappointment more than a betrayal. But it was the first time Timothy understood that sometimes people leave not because they stop caring, but because they can't bear to stay. The second name struck harder. A colleague he admired, a man he considered brilliant, charismatic, endlessly talented. They worked together on a project that meant the world to him, a story that carried pieces of his own life woven through its script. But as the production advanced, he learned that this colleague had rewritten scenes behind his back, shifting the emotional center toward his own character, diluting the authenticity Timothy had fought for. When confronted, the man smiled, a calm, calculated smile, and said it was for the good of the film. That moment changed Timothy, not because the work was altered, but because he saw, with devastating clarity, how ambition can consume someone from the inside, until even betrayal feels justified. The third name cut deeper than he ever expected. It was a family member, someone who should have been his anchor when fame became overwhelming. During a turbulent period marked by illness and exhaustion, Timothy confided in him, hoping for understanding. Instead, private details of his struggles leaked to others, twisted, reshaped, and eventually used against him in ways he still finds difficult to articulate. The pain was not only in the betrayal itself, but in realizing that trust, when broken within a family, does not heal. It scars. That wound never faded. It became a silence between them, thick and permanent. The fourth name was the loudest of all because it wasn't just a person, it was a public, a crowd, a wave of strangers who turned on him during a particularly vulnerable chapter of his life. Misinterpretations of a performance, misquoted interviews, and a storm of criticism erupted suddenly, unfairly. The newspapers magnified each word, each expression, until the man they described barely resembled him. For weeks he felt hunted by opinions he couldn't escape. That experience etched something lasting inside him, a fear of how easily the world can twist a truth, how quickly admiration can sour into condemnation. It wasn't the criticism itself that haunted him. It was the feeling of being erased by voices that never knew him. And then there is the fifth name, the one he rarely admits, even to himself. It is the name he carries every morning when he looks into the mirror, the name that breathes with him, ages with him, questions him, himself. The man who stayed silent when he should have spoken. The man who trusted too much, forgave too quickly, carried burdens he should have set down. He blames himself for the doors he never opened, for the fears he let shape him, for the opportunities he walked past because he couldn't believe he was worthy. This final wound is the deepest because it has no face, no voice, no hand to point at. It is rooted in regret, the kind that gently corrodes a life over years. And yet, despite the weight of these five names, Timothy Spall continues forward. Not because the wounds healed, but because he learned to carry them without letting them define him. Each name shaped him, sharpened him, strengthened him. And though forgiveness never came, understanding eventually did. Now, as the evening light settles gently around him, Timothy Spall sits with the calm of someone who has walked through storms long enough to recognize their patterns. The room is quiet. The world outside moves on without urgency, and he, at 76, no longer feels the need to outrun his memories. Instead, he lets them sit beside him, no longer as enemies, but as reminders of a life fully lived, painfully felt, deeply human. He reaches for an old photograph on the table, a younger version of himself, smiling with a confidence he did not yet know was fragile. The sight does not wound him anymore. It simply stirs a tenderness for the man he once was, for the boy who carried fears he never spoke aloud, for the actor who spent decades learning how to turn silence into strength. The five names still exist within him, but they no longer echo with the same sharpness. Time has not erased them. It has softened their edges like seawater shaping stone. Timothy exhales, a long breath that seems to release years of weight. He has not forgiven them, perhaps he never will, but he has come to understand something quieter, something almost peaceful, that some wounds are not meant to vanish. They are meant to be carried with dignity. The room grows dimmer, shadows settle. His voice, when it returns, is little more than a whisper. Maybe forgiveness isn't the destination, he murmurs. Maybe it's the journey we never finish. And as the silence closes around him, two questions linger, unanswered, deliberate, and meant for anyone who listens. Can we truly live without forgiving? Or is it the weight of remembrance that teaches us who we are? Did you by